Hi, welcome to Monkey Mind Fundamentals Part 1. Now, this is the beginning of a 4-part series in which I'm going to introduce you to the mind-body connection. Now, you may have heard of that, you may have not, but, as the name suggests, it's about starting to understand the connection between our mind and our body and how what goes on in our mind can affect our body and what goes on in our body can affect our mind. Now, this is the first part, which is about the stress response. Now, when we jump into this, I'm going to be talking about things that will require you to have seen the whiteboard animation. So there's 3 whiteboard animations in the Inner Balance coaching system. Hopefully you've seen those already. If you haven't, I would strongly suggest that you pause now and you go and watch those 3 first. Otherwise, some of what I'm going to be talking about may not make that much sense. Okay, so we're going to jump straight in now. And as a reminder, if you've watched the whiteboard animations, what we introduced you to in that was this idea that we've got sort of 2 minds, if you like. There's the sensible human mind, and then there's what we refer to as the monkey mind, okay? Now, we're really going to be focusing on that part in the stress response to understand that. Now, all animals, all species have a stress response, so we're no different. Now, we're going to talk about that stress response, what it is, how it works, and how that affects you. Now, this is really important information to understand because in terms of improving how we feel, a fundamental is understanding how we work. Because if you don't really understand how your mind and body works, then you're pretty much powerless to actually make changes, okay? So, let's look at the part, if you like, of the brain where we could say the monkey lives is what we call the limbic system. There isn't really a monkey. It doesn't really live there, okay? But it just makes it easier to talk about. So this thing called the limbic system, that comprises of a bit of brain called the hippocampus. Now, that deals with lots of things, but what we're interested in is how our brain works on patterns. It works on templates, okay? It's kind of like a computer software program, okay? There's another part of the limbic system which is called the amygdala, which is the center of the fight and flight response. Now, you may have heard of that, okay? Now, that's a very, very primitive part of the brain. And then we've got a part called the hypothalamus, and that regulates the chemical responses that are released, so the neurotransmitters, the neurochemicals that are released into your brain, into your body, okay? So altogether, that's the limbic system. Now, it may sound when we're talking about the monkey mind like it's kind of against us. It's our sort of enemy in some way. It isn't. It's really important to understand that your limbic system does a huge amount of things. It's doing them now as you're watching me. But fundamentally, it's here to keep you safe, to keep you alive. So you must understand that everything it does from the perspective of keeping you safe, okay? So let's jump straight in and see it in action. Now, I want you to imagine that, let's say right now, you're using the sensible human part of your brain, everything's absolutely fine, and you leave wherever you are in a minute, and as you're walking down the road, you bump into a 9-foot polar bear right in front of you. Now, what would happen if that happened? Now, if we slow that down and we imagine that there's this big 9-foot polar bear in front of us, that information is going into our senses. So 24 hours a day, all of our senses are taking in information and it's basically looking for danger, okay? So we would see that image of the polar bear. That image gets sent, if you like, by high-speed broadband into this bit of the brain called the hippocampus, where it's looking for templates. And what it's saying is there any danger? Now, at this moment, when this is happening, your sensible human mind hasn't even clocked on yet to the fact there's a polar bear in front of it. This is faster than the human mind, okay? So it goes to the hippocampus, it looks and says, is there any danger? The hippocampus says, oh yeah, that's a predator, that's dangerous. So it wakes up it knocks on the door, if you like, of the amygdala. It triggers the amygdala, which is the fight and flight response. And you could say that, again, this is where the monkey lives. So instantly that triggers. So it goes from the human mind being in charge to instantly the monkey mind takes over. It doesn't ask the human for permission. Bang, it takes over in a millisecond like that. Then it wakes up the hypothalamus and it asks for a massive shot of adrenalines. So that's neurotransmitters. So that what you would do then in the case of that polar bear is that you would see that the monkey bit of brain takes over. You're pumped full of all these neurochemicals that gives you all of this energy to be able to, jump over a wall and run away and, have more energy than you would normally have, okay? So let's imagine that that's happened. You see that, this all triggers, you release these neurochemicals and you jump over a wall, you manage to escape, you get back home, you lock the door, you're safe. Hopefully then you calm down, the stress response, lowers, and you were safe, okay? It all worked perfectly. So that's how our stress response works. But what happens afterwards? If you'd had a really close shave like that with a polar bear, for example, and it could be anything, by the way, it doesn't have to be a polar bear. When you went to bed that night, having had that experience, would you think about it? You're laying in bed with the lights off. Would you think about that polar bear? You would. But what would you be thinking? Would you be thinking how successful that was and how amazing your limbic system was because it triggered in a split second and it gave you exactly the right mixture of neurochemicals in a split second to enable you to escape? No, the chances are you wouldn't be. You'd be thinking, oh my God, I can't believe how close that was and it nearly got me. And what happens if I didn't see it in time? Would it have ripped my leg off? Would I be dead? Would I be in a wheelchair? What happens if I go back tomorrow and it's still there? What happens if it's followed me home? What happens if I forgot to lock the front door? You see, we start to think about things like this, don't we? So we can really start to understand a lot about the brain when we look at this simple situation, because then when we recognize that what our mind does is it doesn't play over what happened, it plays over what might have happened when we think about it, okay? Which is always worse than what did happen, because what actually happened was a complete success, wasn't it? You escaped. But what your mind plays over is, oh my God, this could have happened and this might happen in the future, okay? So the first thing that we can learn from this simple scenario is your brain is obsessive. You probably already knew that and you thought it was just yours, but it's everybody's. Our brains are obsessive by nature, okay? The next thing to understand is that the default setting of your brain, which is a survival mechanism, is to look at the worst case scenario, okay? So when you saw that polar bear, your brain didn't allow you to think, oh, polar bears, they're probably vegetarians, won't be interested in eating me. Your brain screamed, run before you get eaten, okay? So then when you play back that image in your mind, when you're thinking about it, when you're laying in bed afterwards, do you feel relaxed thinking about it, or would you feel scared again? You'd feel scared, wouldn't you, when you're thinking about the polar bear? Now, the next really big thing to understand then is your sensible human bit of brain knows that you're lying in bed just thinking about that event of seeing the polar bear, but the part of your brain that's replaying those images believes it's happening now, okay? I want to get this across again. Your mind cannot tell the difference between real life and imagination. So when you think about that polar bear attack and, oh no, it might have got me and what might happen if it's there tomorrow, you start to panic again, you start to feel fear. That's because your monkey that's dealing with that bit of the brain can't tell the difference between real life and imagination, so it's releasing those neurotransmitters all over again to help you deal with a life-threatening situation which it believes is happening now, but it isn't, okay? So can you start to see how this relates to your life? Looking at how you're thinking about things in your mind when you're worrying about things that have happened in the past, or you're thinking about things that might happen in the future, and you're feeling anxious or scared or frightened or frustrated or annoyed or angry or whatever it is, it's because your brain, the part of your brain that's playing these things over, believes it's happening now, okay? So this is the stress response, and this is the difference between humans and any other species on the planet, is we're the only species who can trigger our stress response through thought alone. And that's what happens to most people most of the time. They're triggering their stress response just by thinking about what has happened or what might happen. And the important thing to understand is every time you have these thoughts, which are generally negative in nature, because that's the default setting of the brain, remember, because it's there to protect you, so it considers the worst instead of the best. That's how people get into these negative loops of thinking. So you're then producing these neurotransmitters. Every single negative thought you have all day, every day, okay? And then that's how we start to feel all the time anxious or angry or frustrated or stressed, because we're literally producing these neurotransmitters that are dripping into our system constantly. And so if you remember again back to the whiteboard animations, we spoke about the stress bucket. So every time we have a negative thought, we trigger these stress responses. That's dripping into our stress bucket. Our stress bucket then fills up. Then we've got real problems. Okay, so that's the end of part 1 of fundamentals. I'll see you again in part 2, where we're going to talk about the stress bucket and sleep and how we empty the stress bucket. Okay, so hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you soon in the next one.